I think one of the biggest challenges that we have with funding church ministry today is the fact that we don't want to talk about it. We have these questions. We sometimes are brave enough to gather together and talk about it at an event like this, but we don't talk about it with other clergy in our community. We don't talk about it with the leaders in our church. We don't talk about it within our families. And what happens when you don't talk about something? Right? It becomes larger than life. And the truth is that dealing with, even if your church is in a situation where you're in a financial kind of fight for your life, if you will, it's always going to seem worse until you start talking about it. And so there's just something magical that happens in that process. But let's look a little bit about some of the things that I believe are really troubling when it comes to the area of church giving, and why I think it should force us not to run away from it, but to run right into it. I had a mentor of mine that used to say, for the difficult things, Ben, look it in the teeth, even if it bites back. And I think this is one of those subjects that we have to. George Barna is definitely a very popular researcher and has done a lot of faith-based research. And I think this particular conclusion comes at the end of one of those bodies of research where he talks about church giving. And I think this represents probably what some of you feel. You probably grew up in a time where there was a general expectation that you didn't need an explanation from the pastor in order to give to the church. You just did. And now all of a sudden, a generation later, or maybe 2 generations later, you're being asked the question, but why should I give to you? And it can be a very frustrating place to be. I think my grandparents understood why they gave to church because it was taught to them. I think we somehow moved into a period, as we'll talk about, called the Great Silence, where we stopped talking about it. And we really raised a generation of people that had no context for why. They just saw the behavior of their parents. And then my generation comes along and we want to know why. And what an incredible opportunity to rediscover why we should give, why we should direct the money that we have in greater quantities than we've ever had, arguably, toward the local ministry. And yet we struggle to answer that question. And so I think this is it. We have the opportunity. No one else has a better supernatural guarantee than the church has, right? We have the ultimate ROI. And yet we sometimes struggle to talk about it. A book that was recently published that I think really should bring to a head a crisis that we have is that if nothing changes, this particular author comes to the conclusion that churches in the next 30 years will lose 70% of its funding. That's a little bit alarming, and I'm not sure I believe that completely, but I do think we'll continue to decline and diminish in the funds that are allocated toward the church unless we change our behavior, unless we actually talk about it. There's a research group, I think they're out of Chattanooga, called Empty Tomb, and they do exclusively religious research. Did I get that right? Chattanooga? All right. They do exclusively research around church giving. And they publish a book they have a publication where they gather all the research and they take a particular slant. And this particular year, they studied billionaires, and they wanted to know about their habits and why don't billionaires generally give to the church. I thought that was a very interesting question. And the number one reason is because billionaires believe, at least the ones they interviewed, that a church wouldn't know what to do with a gift the size that they could give. Isn't that interesting? Now, almost invariably when I share that, somebody in the room goes, well, I wish they'd have talked to me. But the truth is that there's a greater expectation to connect the dollar with the impact. And our ability to do that directly results in our ability to direct the resources that God intended to fund His church to the offering plates within our churches. Have to be able to do that. And so people who could make arguably a considerable difference in the ministries that we have the ability to fund are the people that are not getting the value proposition that we have to offer. And they didn't say that they didn't want to. They didn't say that they didn't believe in the church. They didn't say that it was off the table. They just said simply that they weren't confident that a church would know what to do with a gift the size they could give. I think that's very telling. Again, I don't tell you this because I want you to feel bad. This isn't it. Hopefully what this does is helps reveal, put some flesh and bone on why it is that things are the way that they are and what we might be able to do about it. So this I think is also another one of those aha moments, right? Because we tend not to think, especially when we're not seeing it on a macro level, that things really aren't changing, right? We're managing decline. And as long as our decline wasn't as worse this year as it was last year, then we're gaining. Overall, church giving, all charitable giving increased about 5%. Okay, the pie is getting bigger, right? There's more dollars going to charity, and yet there's fewer dollars going to churches. And churches have historically gotten about a third of all church giving, of all charitable giving. Did you catch that? About 5% growth. The pie was growing. The shrinking section of what's going to churches is one of those things that just is boggling my mind. And I don't think it's because the church is bad or the church is doing wrong things. I think it's simply because we're not taking advantage of some things that are readily and easily accessible to us to be able to direct those funds in the right way. So the problem with church giving or church funding is this, the great silence. We talked about this just briefly, I mentioned it. We went through about a 30-year period. I call it the big church growth movement, right? This is when Bill Hybels and Rick Warren came to prominence. You know those names when I say them? Okay, so they were part of a generation that said, I don't really like how my parents talked about money, and maybe there were some bad experiences they had, and so what did they decide? They decided to grow churches, we can't talk about money. And I don't mean there's certainly two great individuals, and I'm not sacrificing them here for the conversation. I'm saying they represent a school of thought that really took shape over the last 3 decades. That said, if we don't talk about money, then we don't have to deal with the difficult conversations. Then somehow, because people aren't uncomfortable, our churches will grow. And in fact, that hasn't been the case. But a byproduct of that decision is that we've let a generation grow up that has no context for why we should give dollars to the church and the role that plays in the life of a believer. And when the church provides no alternate perspective, right? We're not trying to debate culture here. That wouldn't be profitable, and it would just frustrate us. But if we don't provide an alternative understanding, then the people in our pews only have one perspective to consider. I don't know if you ever quite thought about it like that. But if the media that we consume, the books that we read, the conferences that we go to, the peer groups that we have, if those are the only sources of information that we have about faith and money, and the church is silent, then we are missing an important part of the conversation. We have what I call fat thinking. There was a period of time in church giving where especially between 2000 and 2008, where you could be just a little bit below your budget and someone was liquid enough to cover the difference. You could go to them and they would write you a check for $300,000, $500,000, and you would scoot by on December 31st and start January 1 fresh again. And so what did we do? We based an assumption of growth into our models, into our budgeting models. And so we kept growing, and we kept growing, and we kept growing. The only problem was we were looking at the top line. We weren't looking at the number of givers. We weren't looking at per capita giving. We weren't looking at segmentation of our givers so that we could understand, was there a swell at the bottom of people who needed to grow in understanding that they should give? Was there a lack of movement in people who were giving but weren't being challenged to be consistent in their giving? And was there an absence of challenging people who were consistent givers who had never thought about giving in a generous capacity? And so we kind of just got comfortable. And because of that, we kind of just let money go on autopilot. And as a result of it, we built in some things that I think felt very painful when 2008 happened. And all of a sudden, the people who we depended on to be liquid weren't quite as liquid as they had been in the past. And then there was a reset. And that was painful. Was it painful for anybody in here? It was very painful. Increased competition. I think somebody said it over here. There's roughly 1.2 million nonprofits in the United States today. 370,000 churches. Let that sink in. 1.2 million nonprofits, 370,000 churches. That means if we were to sit at a table like one of these that you're sitting around, and there were 4 chairs vying for the attention of you, only one voice would represent the church. 3 other voices who would be trying to convince you to give to them, and compound that with the fact that the voice representing the church is silent. So increased competition and almost an absence of conversation. It's created a problem. And then we based a lot of our giving on the fact that people were present every weekend. I mean, that's really when you look back at some of the history of how we got to our understanding and our practice of weekly tithes and offerings. It was a movement from the agrarian culture into the industrialization. And people got paid, instead of seasonally, they got paid weekly. And guess what happened? The church adapted to what we understand weekly tithes and offerings. Well, there was a long history in America where church was the center of the community, right? It was where political events happened. It was where community events happened. You went to church. You weren't a member of that community unless you went to church. Well, that's how we built our funding structure, right? There's your physical presence in a particular geographic location at a particular prescribed time. What happens when people's habits go from 50 to 52 weeks out of the year to 24 to 26 weeks out of the year? And how many of your people, when they're out, rush to you the next week with a check and an offering envelope that says, "Pastor, I was out, and I just want to make sure this gets in"? Nobody, huh? My goodness. If our funding model is based upon people attending church, and they're attending church less, and we don't adapt to that, then where they have half as much opportunity to give, but they don't give twice as much, even though they're coming half as much, right? That equation would work, right? But unfortunately, that's not what's happening. And because of 2008, we have a new normal. People became very cognizant of what they had, what disposable income that they had. And they became very concerned that what they did with it had to count. And I don't think it created this expectation, but I think it very much accelerated an expectation and a conversation that was already quietly happening in murmurs and quiet spaces of our lives. And it said, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't just give to the church because the pastor says we should. Maybe we should ask for why. And why should charitable giving be divided by 501c3, right? The tax status, the governmental the institution by which gives you the authority to be a nonprofit and accept tax-deductible donations. Why should the kingdom be separated by that? This is the thought of the people in the pews. And so this whole atmosphere accelerated that conversation, and so shift happened, and many of us, because we weren't paying attention, we weren't doing anything wrong, we just weren't paying attention, we weren't aware. It happened before we knew it happened, and then we started to realize it on, again, continued decline, slowly but surely, and we can't seem, no matter what we do, to reverse those trends. So really, though, what's interesting about money is that money in and of itself is never the issue. Money is an external reality of an inward commitment. And so we, in fact, have been trying to treat the issue of stewardship and church funding as though it were an economic issue and not a spiritual issue.